No policy response to climate change is gender neutral. At COP25 2 years ago in Madrid, the parties to the UNFCCC adopted a 5-year enhanced Lima work program on gender and a gender action plan to continue the work on advancing gender balance and integrating gender considerations into the work of the UNFCCC. The Nordic countries have progressive gender policy, and requirements to ensure gender equality and balance are laid down in laws and national strategies. At the regional level, the Nordic Council of Ministers Action Plan for Vision 2030 outlines gender equality as one of 3 interdisciplinary perspectives that touch on all activities in the Council of Ministers. But how do climate policies impact gender? And how does gender impact climate policies? And what does this look like in a specifically Nordic context? Hello, and welcome to this event entitled Gendered Impacts of Climate Policy. My name is Aaron Taki, and I am here as part of the Nordic Working Group on Climate and Air. Welcome to our members of the public here, to those streaming online, and those at our hub in Helsinki. We are here to discuss those questions that I just mentioned. The Nordic Working Group on Climate and Air recently commissioned a study to investigate gender and climate change in the Nordic contexts under the auspices of the Nordic Council of Ministers. The study has been carried out by the sustainability consultancy Panelist in cooperation with environmental, social, and human rights specialist Gabriela Factor. Today, we will be joined by members of Panelist and a panel of 3 speakers to give reflections on the report presented to us by Panelist, which I can also add was published today on our website, norden.org. We can provide you with information on where you can find the policy brief of this report. So, I would like to make, first of all, Panelist welcome. So welcome to Raike Fischer-Borgersen, Katrin Weber, and Nina Lander Svensson, who will give you a presentation of the report before we go over to our panel and begin a discussion on what some of the insights are from this report and how we can move forward with the gender mainstreaming agenda. So I'll hand over to first you, Katrin. The stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Aaron. If you were a car company having to sell this electric car, you would, of course, try to make it appealing for your end user, for those people driving it. But as pointed out by the very celebrated author Caroline Perez in her book Invisible Women, it turns out then that when car companies design cars for people, they in reality tend to design cars for only half of the population, men. At least those with male bodies. As a result of this, women are 47% more likely to get injured in a car accident. The reason behind this inequality, this very disturbing inequality, is of course not bad intention or an unwillingness to sell cars to women. It has to do with gender blindness. It has to do with the historical structure that takes human to be equivalent with man. It has to do with a sociocultural hierarchy where masculinity is treated as something that is of higher value than femininity. This example illustrates how gender-neutral thinking is based on gender blindness. And this illustration, too, is a way of giving an impression of how this gender-neutral thinking influences the solutions of our society in a way that is not gender-just. Today will not be about cars, it will be about climate policies in the Nordic countries. Because gender-neutral thinking or gender blindness also constitutes a risk when developing and implementing climate policy. Before we go more into details in the gendered effects of climate policy in the Nordic countries, I'll just give you a brief overview of our presentation today. We'll start out by very briefly introducing the concepts, what we talk about when we talk about gender today. We'll also give you an impression of our methods in the study we did and the scope of this study. We'll also introduce the analytical framework and comment also on some of our insights into gender representation within policymaking. However, today we have chosen to focus very much on how climate policies impact gender, and we are doing this by focusing on two themes, namely the gender-segregated labor market and gendered patterns of consumption and use. Finally, Aaron will facilitate a panel debate where we'll invite some key experts in this theme to the stage and hopefully have a nice talk about these perspectives in both a Nordic context and also outside a Nordic context. Yeah, we made this slide to give you an impression, or make it clear at least, that we have a reflexive approach to the concept of gender. I'll not go into details into this, but I will say that we are aware of the limitations of applying this binary construction or understanding of gender, as it is, of course, a spectrum. However, as this binary understanding of gender very much informs structures of society, we do need to understand the consequences of this. As gender identity is, of course, only one parameter in which you can be either privileged or marginalized, we also have taken into consideration other identity markers such as income level and ethnicity, education, and etc. With this said, Nina will introduce the framework guiding our study, and I'll give the word to you.
Yes. So how do climate policies impact gender? And how do gender impact climate policies? So what we've done is to create this analytical framework. And we look partly into the gendered norms and attitudes, and secondly into the gendered representation. Looking into the gendered attitudes, we see that women in general find that climate policies is more important, and they are more positive towards radical solutions to climate change. And when we look into the representation, you can say that most policy areas somehow are engaged with climate policies. So when we look into the parliaments and the ministries, we see an equal gender representation understood as a share between 40% and 60% of men and female. But that does not necessarily translate into gender mainstreaming of climate policies, because we also need to ask how climate policies impact gender, and we need to be aware of this linkage to actually pay attention to it when we develop climate policies. Of course, it's also important to look at who else are involved in climate policy making, because it's not only the politicians. We also have a range of stakeholders, and these tend to be represented by the sectors being those emitting the most carbon emissions. And these sectors also tend to be male-dominated. So therefore, we also need to look at who do we invite into climate policy making? Do we remember to invite women's rights associations into climate policy making? And do we remember to think of how climate policies impact gender? And that's what we're going to talk about today. And this presentation is based on a study that we have made. We looked into literature. We have looked into climate action plans of each of the Nordic countries to see whether they address gender. And we find that it's only in very few cases, we've seen that female women are explicitly mentioned in climate policies, or at least in climate action plans. And we have asked the different ministries and civil servants how they work with gender, the gender perspective in climate policy making. And lastly, we have held 6 focus group interviews with representatives from gender organizations and with focal points working with the gender and climate policy interface. And we've looked into 4 sectors, and that's construction, agriculture and food, energy,
Mobility.
and mobility. Exactly. And we invited stakeholders to have their perspective on how climate policies impact gender and how gender impact climate policies.
Yeah, thank you. Occupational gender segregation is a reality in the Nordic countries. And therefore it is very relevant to ask for who the jobs of the green economy, the decarbonization, is for. So to put it shortly, we have dug into the question of how climate policies impact the distribution of work. As climate policies is very much framed as a rather scientific and technological matter, it very much calls for professions and educations from the STEM, from science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And as you can see on the graph here, the educations and professions from STEM are very male-dominated in all the Nordic countries, as well as in the EU. Furthermore, when climate policies also tend to downplay the importance of the social interpretations and the contextual considerations, even the logics of care, it also tends to then downplay the role of the female-dominated fields of knowledge. So with a dominant focus on technology, climate policies, you can say that we are risking then to reinforce the gender-segregated labor market in the Nordic countries. However, if we include more women into STEM, and if competences from social sciences are included in developing and implementing climate policies, it can contribute to both a transition to a low-carbon society and to gender equality at the same time. In the Nordic countries, women still carry out most of the work in our households. On a daily basis, women in the Nordic countries, in Scandinavia, are spending 40 minutes more doing housework than men. And actually in EU, this is 70 minutes more than men. So what does this have to do with climate policies, you could ask? Climate policies that put emphasis on the responsibility of the individual, of the consumer, or within the households, also increase the load of informal, unpaid work in these households, in the domain of everyday lives. And thereby you could say that climate policies risks adding to the burden of unpaid housework done by women. And I would like to read a quote, and this is a quote from a UK study on the embodied on the embodied politics of climate change, and it's done by Joanna Wilson and Eric Chu. Increasingly stringent reduce, reuse, recycle regulations result in a double day for many women in the name of climate change mitigation. By applying an environmental lens to the household jobs of climate change, women are not only expected to become a hockey mom, full-time mom, or a yummy mom, but they must also be an eco-mom and a good green citizen who shops locally, mends clothes, and recycles religiously. Another issue that needs to be further studied in the Nordic context as well. Has to do with the quality of the employment, the quality of the jobs created in the green economy. As also a study from the UK shows, the jobs, for instance, within recycling are often taken up by male migrant workers and done under precarious working conditions. And we recommend, on the basis of our study, that policymakers give considerations not only to gender, but to multiple relations of inequality, and thereby are not leaving the role of, for instance, migrant workers under the radar. While this intersectional perspective should be taken into consideration, the reality still is that the new green jobs are in most cases created within very male-dominated sectors, as Nina said, within energy, transport, etc. All the while, climate policies do not often include investment into female-dominated sectors. For instance, low-paid care jobs, or does not take the informal, unpaid work in the households into consideration. And climate policies does not only risk to reinforce this gender-segregated labor market, it also, or thereby, are in risk of exacerbating the gender pay gap in the Nordic countries, which are now 14.3% in the favor of men, of course.
But how do climate policies impact the gendered consumption? A single man in average emits 10 tons CO2 a year, compared to a woman emitting 8.4 CO2 a year. And that's not because a man is born a man, it's due to the cultural pattern and our understanding of gender. So men in general use or tend to use more fuel. They drive more in car, whereas women tend to use more of their consumption on furniture and textiles. So, women laughing alone with salad was a trend, and it really shows a very stereotype picture of a woman and our consumption of food. So when we look into the food and how it differs between men and women, we see that men, also when you look, you take away the weight of the food, how much we eat, men in general tend to eat more meat and use a higher carbon footprint on food compared to women. And that means when we are designing climate policies that are targeting or trying to change our food consumption patterns, we need to take into account how women and men eat and how we eat differently. For example, if you have a tax on meat, you need to ask, who will this tax actually target? Will it target men or will it target women? But of course also we need to take into account other factors and variables such as income. And we see in general when we look into the consumption footprint, income is still the very much or the most important factor in explaining our consumption footprint. Climate policies are also very much about how we plan cities and how we plan for more sustainable infrastructure. So we see differences in how men and women, they transport themselves. So men tend to drive more in car, whereas women tend to use public transportation more. They tend to bike more and walk more. But still, when planning infrastructure, we see that it's very car-centric. So we plan after cars. And that we also do when thinking of the sustainable city, we plan after the electrical car, rather, or to a lesser extent, after public transportation, for example. And we need to pay that into account, this gendered difference in our mobility patterns when we plan cities. There's a study in Sweden showing that the driver of domestical solar panels are often men. And that might be due to the fact that men are exposed to technology in their upbringing in another extent that women are. So women are not against solar panels in no way, but they might not have the same interest and capacity to implement and drive these solar panels. And that impact, because in the Nordic countries there have been several examples where the public have financed solar panels, so that tend to also impact how it's taken up by men and female. Lastly, we see that, as I mentioned, women tend to use more their consumption on textiles or clothing and furniture. And you can ask why that is. We have found very little evidence, but we know that how we wear, which clothes we wear, is also a way to express our identity. So we need way more knowledge to understand our consumption patterns in depth. And I just want to add that the consumption patterns is not due to the higher income level. It's not because men earn more, because they actually only use 2% more on consumption, whereas the carbon footprint is 16% more. So we need to take that into account. And now I'm going to hand over to Ulrike.
So thank you very much. And as Nina mentioned at the beginning, or was it Katrine, we of course have some other examples in the report that we would very much say that you should dig into and read, also from the food sector and agriculture. So the solution to both gaining gender equality and reducing climate change is of course not that women adopt a more cultural male behavior, which would actually then, what we see, increase the carbon emissions. Now, it can instead maybe improve gender equality when men take up more climate responsible behavior and perform some of the more culturally feminine behavior in terms of caring for the planet and caring for nature. So we would say that all in all, some of the structural changes required to mitigate carbon emissions are an occasion to rethink the social cultural understanding of masculinity, and that embracing more carbon neutral transportation patterns, for example, and reducing meat consumption and so on, would naturally provide it would become a more neutral conceived and less linked to gender. We also need to make the policy process more inclusive and strive for this, because we do need all the different competencies to ensure an efficient and fair transition. So we can say that our conclusions are that gender-blind climate policies do tend to reinforce gender inequalities, and the climate policies offer a chance to increase gender equality. Also, we say that climate policy making calls for interdisciplinary and intersectional approaches. In the report and in the policy brief that is online today, as mentioned, we do have some recommendations for both the Nordic Council ministers and also for the Nordic governments. And our recommendations, we have 4 of them. Overall recommendations are to support the generation of more gender data and knowledge, which we can see that there's a vast lack of. It's also to facilitate knowledge sharing, including networks and gender climate platforms. We see that there are already, we can say, networks between researchers and so on within this theme, but it is quite difficult to find resources and persons who dig into both subjects and both work with climate and
And gender.
Yeah, sorry. I just we also say that we should implement a common and more systematic approach to gender mainstreaming, including gender impact assessments, and identify and address institutionalized gender norms. So we'd like to invite Erin to the stage to facilitate a debate. And also, of course, our three panelists, Eva Larsen, Anna-Marie, and Oras Tynkkynen.
Yeah.
Not yet.
Can I get a mic? Yeah? Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nina, Katrine, and Reike, for your presentation. I saw we had a few members of the audience taking some photos of your recommendations, so we hope that they go long and far and that they make a good impact on our future work with whatever it is that we're all working with here and within the UNFCCC. So I would like to now welcome our three panelists to come to the stage. So Eva Larsen, current chairperson of Green Women in Sweden and former parliamentarian in the national Swedish government. Anne-Marie Abagu from an NGO based in Nigeria called Women Environmental Program. And Oras Tynkkynen, who works for the Finnish consultancy Tyrsky and former parliamentarian in the Finnish government. So welcome to the stage. Bring your headsets with you, because if we have some questions, you might need to listen to them using the headset. So, grab a seat. So we have a few questions, and we'd love to hear your general reactions to the report that's come forward. But to get us warmed up, I thought I would ask a few specific questions. So my first question is to you, Eva. You've previously said that gender equality is a condition for ecological and economic sustainability. My question is, what do you see the risks being in not including gender equality in climate action plans? And we can use this microphone. Thank you.
I apologize for my allergic reaction, so I'm not have COVID. We all know that we don't have it. My reaction of this report is the report proves the need of gender equality, and that is what the Green Women work with. Gender equality is, without gender equality, no climate change and no climate justice. And today we also work with climate justice. And the main point, I think, is that most women don't know how climate intelligent they are. And some women want to be like a guy. So I will say, change your mind and think more guys should be, or all guys should be like women are today. Take responsibility for what they are doing at all levels.
Thank you, Eva. So I'd like to bring Anne-Marie and Oras into the discussion. What we saw now was a presentation. Can we hear me? Yeah? Was a presentation, obviously in a very specific Nordic context. Okay. But I'd be curious to know, because Anne-Marie, you work in the local scene in Nigeria, and Oras, in your consultancy work, you've also worked in a number of international contexts. So what can you see as in the value in this report that you can apply in your work? And importantly, what, if you can hear me as well on the piano, what are the additional factors that we need to consider when looking at this kind of work outside of the Nordic context? So I'll start with you, Anne-Marie, and then a few words from Oras as well, if you would like to share.
Okay.
Oh, you have a microphone.
Yeah, I have a microphone. Okay.
Looking at
the report, I see that from the African context, we have to understand that climate change is not in general terms, in terms of we shouldn't look at climate change and gender as a general issue with Africa, Asia, and basically the global north and the global south. The context is different. How we see climate change in, let's say, for example, in Nigeria, is different from the way someone else in maybe South Africa sees climate change. So we have to understand how climate change affects us. Let me give you an example. An example will be if you're, like in our work, when we're going into the communities, when we're trying to translate how climate change affects them personally, we have to consider the language barrier, and we have to use local terms that they understand. I think that answers. We have to understand that climate change affects everyone, especially women, young people, the physically challenged differently as well. So I think that's one thing we have to put into consideration. Yeah.
Great. Because of course, talking about a climate policy to be more inclusive, gender is obviously just the first step.
Yes.
And there are many other categories we also need to include.
Yeah.
But often gender is not something that's discussed at all either. So this is an important discussion to be had.
Yeah.
Iris, what are your spontaneous thoughts on the report, and in your work in international context, if there's anything that you can take with you from the Nordic context, and what additional factors do we need to bring in when working outside of the Nordic as well?
Well, first of all, I should probably explain why I am sitting on this panel, which is that my consultancy released a report recently specifically on gender equality in international climate policy. So my perspective to today's discussion comes from this international angle rather than what Finland or other Nordic countries should be doing in their national climate policy. And I think one of the very perhaps not surprising conclusions from our study was that there needs to be much better understanding of the gender dimensions of climate policy, and we need much more gender relevant data, which was something that I think was also coming from your report. Mm-hmm. And I think this report can contribute to that better understanding of how gender intersects with climate policy in various different ways. Now, looking at this question from the point of view of international climate policy, I would perhaps just highlight two things. One which is perhaps quite obvious, and one which hopefully might be a bit provocative. Let's see. The obvious one is that in the context of international climate policy and climate negotiations in particular, the way gender has been traditionally integrated is from the point of view of representation. So to what extent different genders are represented in these discussions we are having in COPs like here in Glasgow. And the result has been quite disappointingly that there is quite strong male domination, and female voices tend to be much less represented. So that's, of course, one important aspect to make sure that international climate policy, when we discuss that integrates all these different voices and from a gender perspective, different genders. Now, my other point coming from our report would be that possibly the biggest thing from a gender equality point of view for international climate policy, the biggest question really is whether we succeed in limiting the climate crisis to tolerable levels. And why do I say that? If we head towards 3 degrees of global heating, the impact of that also on gender equality will be devastating in many countries and communities. Whereas if we succeed in limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees, the gendered impacts are likely to be much more tolerable. So perhaps simply succeeding in tackling the climate crisis would be very important also from gender equality, and I think that could also be one kind of entry point to this discussion.
Thank you, Iris. And more reports are getting done, more information is getting out about these important linkages. I'm wondering, what do you, and this is an open question to the panel, what do you see as some of the barriers towards implementing gender mainstreaming and bringing the gender agenda into climate work?
Yes, I catch the open question. I think the biggest barrier is that we don't understand why gender equality is important, especially in the Nordic context, because we think we are so damn gender mainstream. And we don't really understand. You know, when I went into the Swedish Parliament, 1994, we were the most equal parliament in the whole world. We aren't that any longer. Other countries has gone away from us. But we still have 2021, we still have a pay gap around 11%. How is that possible? We haven't understand that we had to be equal, that sexes not should say that you are not worth full paid salary. That is one thing in the Nordic context. In the globe context, I mean, we should be proud, really proud in the Nordic countries, because we have built up a social insurance system that made it possible also for women to work, for women to be poor, for women to for women to get divorced from the guy who hit them and the children. We could do that in the Nordic countries. So on the one side, we should be proud. In the other side, in the Nordic context, we should be shy because we haven't understood yet why gender equality is so necessary and why we need gender equality to get social justice and to get climate justice. We're just walking around, and 82% of the guys in the world, you know, are male, and they are going just now driving the world to chaos. And we say, oh, could I be with you? I want to have power. We had to take the power.
Thank you, Eva. You can keep the microphone. Anne-Marie, Oris, any thoughts? What do you consider the barriers to bringing gender mainstreaming into climate policy?
Okay. Can you all hear me? Okay. For me, one of the biggest barriers is that most of the policies are gender blind. So one of the strategies that my organization we did was we had to help facilitate a national action plan on gender and climate change in Nigeria with the Ministry of Environment. And this action plan was just to help come up with strategies that will help with the implementation of the Paris Agreement and the NDCs in Nigeria. Now, this was like a very good example for other ministries to adopt. So the process is slow. Yes, other ministries are also trying to adopt the action plan. So we're fingers crossed. Let's hope by next year there'll be progress. And another barrier that I see is that most of there's no political will from the government. And most of them are not really, most of them don't really understand the term climate change, because like I said before, everyone understands it differently. So you have to, which is one of the things that we set out to do, that we would sensitize government officials, not just at the federal level, but also at the sub-national level, at the state level. Yeah.
I'd like to bring you into this as well, Oris, and specifically with your background as a parliamentarian. What barriers do you agree with this analysis? Do you see barriers in a parliamentary context? And if you had some recommendation for what parliamentarians could or should do to bring this more thoroughly into the agenda and develop more ambitious climate policy in relation to gender, how could we go about that? A few questions in a bundle there, so engage with what do you feel like?
No, that's quite a lot. I do agree with what was said before, and not to repeat that. I think the lack of awareness, lack of resources are kind of the foundational challenges. In our study, we actually looked at 4 different countries and how they approach gender equality in their international climate policies. So apart from Finland, that was Sweden, Canada, and Mexico. And those countries were chosen because based on our, expert sources, they were considered to be, among the leading countries internationally. And at least to my surprise, none of them had seemed to be, really found it and cracked the code. I was kind of expecting to find countries that could really show the way for Finland, how we should do this. And I was slightly disappointed that it seems that many of these so-called leading countries are still struggling with relatively basic issues when it comes to integrating gender concerns into international climate policy. Now, to your question about the role of parliaments, I think it kind of comes back to what we have been discussing here already. One is really to kind of focus political attention to the gender dimensions of climate policy, which in my experience, at least at the time I was in the parliament, was not a major topic for discussions. And then secondly, I think we quite simply need to also allocate some very basic resources. And let me just give one example from Finland. There is one poor civil servant in the Ministry of Environment in Finland who is supposed to look at gender issues in international climate policy, in addition to all the other tasks she has on her table. And our very pragmatic proposal was to have at least one person in the Finnish ministries that could focus full-time on gender equality across international environmental policy. Now, that doesn't seem to be asking too much, but at least have one person who can focus full-time on these topics. That would be like the bare minimum foundation to begin building on.
That is really true, one person or an office or more. Yeah. But when I went into the parliament, you know, the gender equality was on the main top. It was the main top issue. And we haven't made good result yet anyhow. But today I can make change because I'm a local mayor in a part outside Stockholm, and we do gender budgeting. That is something I really will want to introduce to you, gender budgeting. Yeah. And we also give money to NGO, Green Women. We have money from the government, but as a local mayor, I can give money to women's organizations, small women organizations in the community. And I can also educate that there are women organizations, because everyone knows this sports organization, everybody, woman or man, but they don't know about women's organization. So we could all help each other to understand that this is so damn important. And I will thank you again for the report that shows so that women should not change themselves. They should continue to be that clever they are, and guys should say change and start to drive like a woman.
Thank you, Eva. We've got a bit over 10 minutes left. Before I open up questions from the audience, I would like to bring in one of our key listeners here. I think we might have one or two. Unfortunately, not yet. We have someone working full-time in a lot of ministries with this issue, but we do have a national gender focal point, and we have, I think, one or two of them in the audience right now from the Nordic. If you could just make yourselves known. Okay. So we have with us the National Gender Focal Point in the UNFCCC from Sweden, Jennifer Ernelius. Jennifer, I wanted to ask you what your spontaneous reactions are on this report, and as a civil servant, how can we take the conclusions and recommendations of this report to help us to gender mainstream climate policies?
Can you hear me through the mask?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Just good to remind everyone to keep a mask on and keep a safe distance. Can you hear? Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, I think this report and the recommendations, they can also, first of all, the whole report was issued after a call from the Nordic National Gender and Climate Change Focal Points in order to be able to deliver on the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan, which this year has the activity to to strengthen the evidence base on gender and climate change, but also on women's. Sorry, I can't remember the exact phrase now. But so I'm very happy that we are seeing this report launched here, and that we have recommendations that I think can be very useful. They do go in line with a proposed strategy that the Swedish government now has on the table on how to gender mainstream the implementation of the Paris Agreement. But also listing I mean, the number one recommendation that we see is also about coherence and on how to develop common guidelines on a gender impact analysis for the climate policies in the Nordic countries. And of course, that would be very useful. Also, it also mentions resources. That's of course something that we have also discovered in writing this draft of a strategy, for example, to make sure that they're collected in a common place, so it's easier for everyone to find the data and use more disaggregated data. So I believe that this is another step on the way to have a good overview of the situation also in Scandinavia, and it can help us build a better and more robust policy framework for gender and climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'll take off this headset again, otherwise I'll hear myself on a loop. So let's open up to the floor for questions. We have a roaming microphone going around, so if you would like to ask a question, please just raise your hand and Anna will give you the word.
Thank you very much to the presenters and to the panelists for that very rich presentation. I just wanted to speak to the gentleman. You said, I'm going to paraphrase you, you said you cannot, we should concentrate on bringing down emissions or control climate change. I'd like to observe that you cannot bring down emissions without gender equality, because women are 50% of the population of the world, and their gender differentiated needs, preferences, opportunities, and constraints, if those are not addressed, men and women have different roles to play and responsibilities. And then secondly, and that's the last one, gender issues in the North and in the South may have some similarities, but they're essentially different. That's why, for us, we are driving for gender justice rather than gender equality, because there are lots of grievance redresses to be made for women in the South, for generations of marginalizations and deprivation. Okay, I don't have a lot of time.
Thank you very much for that. So 2 points there about not being able to bring down emissions without 50% of the population, and then about gender justice instead of gender equality. Oris, any comments on that first one directed to you? And then we'll ask about gender justice if anyone wants to speak open to that. But if I could get Oris to respond first, if you would like.
So just to clarify, our whole report is about how to integrate gender equality into climate policies, and how to make sure that the gender dimension is very much represented. So I was not trying to say that focus on reducing emissions and forget gender equality. Quite to the contrary, what I was trying to say was that the climate crisis itself as a problem is a gender issue. And if we fail at tackling the climate crisis, the impact will be much more disproportionately felt by, in many cases, in many societies and communities, by the marginalized people, and that unfortunately in many cases includes a good number of women and girls. So tackling the climate crisis is of course what brings all of us here to Glasgow, and it's important, but it's also important from the point of view of securing that we have a chance of reaching gender equality in the future. Thank you, Ars. Any comments? Gender justice?
Yes. Yeah? I want to put it in this way. We have two things together, men and women. We are all going to die, but we are all born of a woman. Don't ever forget that. We have something together, all women and men. We are all born of a woman. What do I mean by that then? In a global perspective, we had to remember what unite us, and that is what you also unite us to take care of Mother Earth. That is a story, a long story, and it is ongoing story to take care to nurse, to try to make the best thing of sometimes nothing, to look and work and help each other. And I think that is the model for the future. We have to cooperate together in the globe, no more south and north, in the globe. And we are all equal, and we are all going to have this justice, you know, and the justice are going to look very different in different parts of the world.
Any comments you'd like to add, Anne-Marie, before we take the next question?
No, let's take the next question.
Let's see what we have coming up. We had a question over here.
Hi, my name is Kathy Orlando. I am Canadian. I am a mother of 3 girls. I do my work for them every day. I think, first, your research was so valuable, and I'm going to learn more about yours as well. And I'm really humbled to be even able to ask this question, because I think you're amazing, all of you. I just want to suggest that maybe Canada accidentally created a gender fair policy that rewards carbon-conscious consumers and punishes those who don't care so much about carbon consumption. Canada's carbon pricing policy is incrementally rising and returns almost all of the money back to households. And so regardless of your carbon footprint, regardless of your income. So given that women make less money, and it's more so in Canada, tell you now, as well as given that men have a higher carbon consumption, and people who have more money have a higher carbon consumption, this actually reduces income inequality in my country, and it's a first step of giving money back to people for nothing. Just give them money. It goes right to women, because it goes right to our households. So I would like for you to comment on that. I would love that. Thank you.
Great. Who would like to make a comment on that one?
I think it's just a good way to do it. We work with that. We struggle with that. We work with that. Polluter pay, and the money should go back to people, not to the guys who pollute, to the people, to all people, and that is give more money for those who don't have so much. So we work on that. Thank you. Yeah, we look at you. You have done much. Much very clever thing also in your legislations.
Okay, for me, I would say that in my country, well, we have to first of all go past the patriarchy first, because we're still struggling with that first before we start talking about equal pay and yeah. So that will be a welcome idea, but we still have a long way to go. So, that would be great. Okay. Yeah.
That sounds great. And Aras, you also wanted to make a comment?
I am personally a big fan of these so-called cap and dividend or carbon dividend models for the reasons you just outlined. They are not only a way to address carbon pollution and tackle the climate crisis, but also to reduce income inequalities in our societies, and we all know that that is desperately needed. However, I would just like to kind of diversify the discussion by pointing out that there is another paradigm, especially at display in some US systems, which is that rather than simply redistributing the income generated through this scheme to individuals, you could invest in communities. And why that is advocated by many in the US is that then you can target low-income people of color, marginalized communities that have been left behind so many times. And that could also be one way to take into account climate justice. I'm not saying one is bad and the other is good, but I just wanted to bring that here.
Thank you, Aris. We've unfortunately only got about 1 minute left, so I thought if you could give one recommendation to the Nordic governments, the panelists, you've got about 10, 15 seconds each. What would that be?
The first thing is be proud of what we have done in the social insurance system. Be proud, and the second is try to understand why gender equality is necessary to have this climate change. You know, you can't do it without without women in power making, in decision making at all levels. Not only the finance minister, also in the industries and at every workplace. You know, change system, take down the patriarchal system. That is a very clear answer.
Okay, for me, I just have one recommendation, and that is that with all the gender policies and climate policies that we're putting in place, it will be great to have like a monitoring mechanism that will monitor how effective these policies are being implemented, both at the Nordic and at the international level too. Yeah.
I can very much support that. And then one of the conclusions in our report, and there was unfortunately no time to highlight that here, was that to the extent that gender equality is addressed in international climate policy, it is still from a very narrow definition of women and girls rather than a broader intersectional dimension taking into account different gender identities. And I think there I see a role for Nordic countries, because I mean, who else if not Nordic countries could raise this to the discussions in international climate policy?
Yes.
Thank you, Oris. I hope that this event can be a starting point to continue our dialogue on this very important topic. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to Plan Milieu. You can get a copy of our policy report online. If you'd like more information about that, please do be in touch. Thank you and have a great evening.
Thank you.